Well, week 5 of I've Always Wondered, you all causing me a lot of pain through the questions you've answered, or asked. I guess I'm trying to answer them. First week, we talked about heaven. We talked about giving and tithing the second week. We looked at slavery the third week. Last week, we talked about the Trinity. And then this week, simple topic about the Old Testament law. Simple. And on one hand, it's been a very difficult 5 weeks when I thought, it's not going to be so bad. But as God dives you in and drives you to maybe a different place or different answers or different scriptures or different thoughts, right? It works you over a little bit. If you're open to that, which I'm always open, I don't know why, but being open to being worked over by God a little bit, a lot. And then next week we're going to end, essentially I think I'm calling it the conversation. And I really want to talk about the significance and importance of followers of Jesus engaging conversation and being tremendous conversationalists. We need to be better at and good at it. So I think that's where it's going. I don't know, but we'll see. I'm probably feeling like it's going to be easy message, and it'll probably be the most difficult, is the way it turns out. So the question, well, where are we at? Let's see. First we know this is the beginning of the conversation, right? That's what this is all about. And this is going to cause more questions, because I can't answer the question really in 30 minutes, and I can't give you a full understanding of the law, the Old Testament law, in the brief little snippet I want to cover in the beginning before diving into some of Jesus' words. So there's hopefully a lot more questions that lead us into better conversation about this. And so here was the question: does Jesus ever say what Old Testament laws to follow? And I don't know if the second part was added, but I kind of added it because I think it matters of what the apostles said. And there's something they did say about this that maybe we don't read right as well. And so we want to talk about that. So did Jesus ever say anything? Well, we need to talk a little bit about the law, right? But that's a challenge, because talking about the law is really the significant conversation that needs to take place. And as I dive into it, I trying to figure out what's a simple way of getting at the heart of it all. And it was interesting. I felt like God directed me to go back to old seminary notes from my first Old Testament class. And I was surprised at what I read. It was like the 5th, 6th line of notes that I read at the beginning of this series or this class on the Old Testament. And I loved it because it's exactly what we've been saying. And the professor said, the Old Testament is not an answer book. It's meant to drive you to prayer, reflection, and discussion. And I'm like, woohoo! That's where we've been. That's what I've been feeling. That's what we've been talking about is it's not an answer book. And I would say the same for the New Testament, right? It's not an answer book. It's a place that we should be driven to find answers, to seek God, to pray, and to discuss, right? To reflect and see what God is saying to us. So I love that. And so that's what this is going to be about today. We're actually going to be opening the Bible today. We haven't done this through this entire series, right? I've just kind of been summarizing, but it's significant that we look at some of the words that Jesus says, and something in Deuteronomy we'll get at as well. But how do you summarize the law? Well, some would say, right, that God gave the 10 Commandments, and then He gave 613 other laws. Well, then you begin to read what rabbis think about that, and they cannot agree and don't believe there's 613 at all. And they're like, no, there's more, there's duplicates, there's less. And so you're like, holy moly, right? The idea that you come to the text not looking for answers, but trying to find Yahweh and have discussion. And so we can't even agree from a rabbinic thought standpoint what they all are. And from a Christian standpoint, if you want to look at that, then you just Google to your heart's content, and you will find 48,000 different answers for how the law should be used today. And you're like, whoa, I mean, what is it? So I want to give 3 summary points. I know you're like, seriously? That's it? 3 summary points about the law? Yeah, that's it. If I'm thinking, right, if we're looking at, here's God calling these people out, and we have to think about this. This is important. He's calling them out of generations of slavery, wanting to set them apart to be His holy people and create this new nation of Yahweh followers, it's significant what he writes and how he's trying to reframe how they live. And so here's my 3 summaries. And again, you don't have to agree with them. That's the whole point, right? But this is where I arrive with my summary. What's the purpose of the law? 1 is to know him. Right? The purpose of the law is to know Yahweh. Is for the people to know him. The second one is to teach them how to be set apart so they're different from the surrounding nations. And then the third one is they need to know how to live. Right? They've been in slavery. They have 0 idea. So he's trying to teach them how to be healthy spiritually, how to be healthy physically, how to be healthy emotionally. How are they going to live and function as the set-apart nation following only this one God, which is completely different than everybody else in the ancient Near East. And so what does Jesus want to say about this? Because Jesus is a good Jew, right? He's a good Jew. And so what does he say about the law? Well, if you have your Bible or an electronic device, we're going to look at a bunch of different passages. We're actually going to look at the first one here, and you don't need to turn here because I'm just going to read this in Deuteronomy. But you can turn to Matthew chapter 5 is where you can start. But I like how in Deuteronomy, right? Deuteronomy says the same thing almost over and over about what we're supposed to do. But starting in Deuteronomy 10:12 really says what the focus should be. It says, "Now Israel, what does the Lord God require of you?" What does he require? To fear the Lord, to be reverent, to walk with him, to love him, to serve him with all your heart and soul. Hey, that sounds familiar. Sounds like what we're supposed to do with Jesus, right? And to keep the commandments and statutes of the Lord, which I'm commanding you today. But what does he say first? To walk with him, love him, and serve him. The focal point of the law is to walk with God, to serve God, and love God. And then if we jump to 11:1, it says, "You shall therefore love the Lord your God and keep his charge, his statutes, his rules, and his commandments. You shall love him, and you shall walk with him, and you shall follow him, and you shall be obedient to him." God trying to build this nation of set-apart people with the focus being love, serve, walk with Yahweh. Man, we need to hear that as we begin to digest what Jesus is about to tell us about the law. Now, I want to start here a little bit because as we begin to look at what Jesus says, there's a lot of different interpretations. Right? We have Gentile Christians who would call themselves Torah observant Christians. So they're trying to follow the law. And we knew a lot of those folks in Oklahoma. There was a big movement in the 90s in Oklahoma, and so there was a lot of residual of that. And so I met a lot of Torah observant Christians, and it was fascinating what they followed and what they didn't. And then as I met different groups of them, it was amazing what part of the Torah they followed and what part they didn't, and they didn't agree on what they followed and what they didn't. Well, that was interesting. How did you come up with that? And then, right, then you meet folks who love to pick and choose the law. Ooh, I love to pick out the parts that really promote my agenda, but not the parts that really just don't make any sense. I like to pick out the parts that give me power or control over others, but not that. And it's outrageous, right, as you begin to talk to different people. And then again, if you go read and study, you'll find, okay, well, we don't have to follow those, but we should follow these. And then Paul says this, and by the way, that wasn't part of the question about what does Paul say, so I'm not even worried about that. But Paul says that, and so I'm going to take that, but I like this. And so what is it exactly I'm supposed to do? Because one of them, I mean, if you've read through some of these laws, I'm not going to repeat some of them because some of them I think would embarrass me saying them in this setting. But one I found was quite intriguing, a law that maybe I was trying to understand how this came about many years ago. But did you know this one? If 2 men are fighting and one of the men's wives jumps in and she grabs the other guy below the belt, and you know what I mean, we got to cut off her hand. Are you like, why was this occurring? Right? Doesn't that come to you like, really? 2 men were fighting, their wives were jumping in and grabbing below the belt? But God had meaning for some of these. But so do we follow that one? I mean, if Chuck and I get into it and Cindy or Lori jump in, and I mean, yeah, I mean that, really? Yeah, I mean, is do we follow that? Or really, right, the text is saying an eye for an eye. There's that in there. In a fracture for a fracture, in a tooth for a tooth. Hey, I like that one. When Chuck hits me, I'm hitting back, right? I mean, that sounds like the right one to follow. Or the ones that we really don't want to touch these, where we actually don't charge interest to people, or we give back their land after a certain amount of time and we let them out of the oppression or the bondage we've put them in. Heck no, because that I really like that oppression and bondage I have them in. Helps me control, right? So how do you pick and choose? So let's look at what Jesus says in Matthew. So Jesus is in the Sermon on the Mount here. Okay, context again is important. Speaking mainly, his ministry is to the Jewish people. Okay? And we know already that the Pharisees, the Sadducees, even here, most likely are saying things about Jesus that aren't true. And you get from the context of what we're about to read, you get the idea that what they're saying to Jesus is he says the law, you don't need the law anymore. Okay, that Jesus is preaching something else. You don't need this law anymore. And so Jesus, in the midst of the Sermon on the Mount, which, by the way, he's bringing a deeper meaning, actually, to the law, right? He's bringing a deeper meaning and understanding that the rule makers and the Pharisees, who love to really frame them the way they wanted for their advantage, right? Jesus addresses it. And here's what he says. He says, "Do not think that I've come to abolish the law or the prophets." The law or the prophets is the entirety of the Hebrew Scripture. "Do not think I've come to abolish it." Intriguing. Well then, Jesus, what did you come to do? "I've not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them." And again, you can look up different translations and understandings and interpretations of this word fulfill, but hopefully as we continue to read, we'll get context. But Jesus has come to fulfill, complete these laws. "For truly," he says, "I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not an iota, not a dot, will pass from the law till all is accomplished." Okay? I've not come to abolish it. I've come to fulfill it. It's not going away. "Therefore, whoever relaxes one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom, but whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven." So Jesus is saying, I didn't come to abolish, I came to fulfill them. And whoever teaches them essentially in the correct way, by the way, who can teach them in the correct way? Jesus. Okay, so the Pharisees can't. They can't grasp because they're not God, and so they're using them to teach and utilize them the way they want to utilize them. And then you get this idea in verse 20, a little sarcasm here. "For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom." So Jesus is saying, I've come not to get rid of them. Don't listen to what they're saying. They don't understand. I've come to fulfill them. And by the way, I'm essentially the only one who can truly bring meaning to them and teach them fully. Which leads me to this quote that I really liked, that his Jewish Christian readers needed to know that the pattern for righteousness that he taught reflects the true meaning of the Torah, and that the Torah in its entirety is preserved in and through the teaching of Jesus. I love that idea, right? Jesus is saying, I've come to fulfill it, and I'm the only one that can really teach it. Everybody else is going to have the wrong slant. They might have a selfish slant. They might have a slant because they misunderstand it, but I not only can fulfill it, I teach it completely. And as we continue, if we were to read through this, he continues to bring meaning at a greater depth than the Pharisees could ever imagine, and which was challenging their own power structure. We always have to get the political aspect of the text here as well, not just the spiritual. He's always challenging their political power over the people as well. And they don't like it, that's why they want to get rid of him. Okay? So let's have this in mind. Let's keep this in mind. Now, so Jesus says, I haven't come to get rid of it. I've come to fulfill it. And essentially, I'm the only one who can teach it. Okay, so now jump ahead in Matthew to 22. Once again, Jesus being challenged, as he's always being challenged, first by the Sadducees, who don't agree, don't believe in resurrection, essentially, so they're challenging him, and then the Pharisees come together. And I love how Matthew records this. It says, when the Pharisees heard that he had silenced the Sadducees, right, they didn't have a thing to say, they gathered around him. And one of them, a lawyer. I love that Matthew calls this out. So I guess the lawyer guy, he's going to be the best one to be able to reason. He's going to be able to reason the best. Maybe trap Jesus because they ask him a question, they're testing him, right? They want to test what does he say, because if he really is a good Jew and he really is a guy that's fulfilling the law and that knows the law and is following the law, then he should be able to answer the question properly. So they say, "Teacher, what is the great commandment in the law?" And Jesus says, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the great and first commandment. And the second's like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself." On these two commandments, look what he says, depend the entirety of the Hebrew Scriptures. Jesus, who said he came to fulfill the law and could teach them like none other and truly understood them, has just said what we need to follow. He says the entirety of what Yahweh laid out for the nation of Israel is loving God completely, which is exactly what Deuteronomy says, right? Deuteronomy says the exact same thing. Love God, walk with him, follow him. Jesus says the rest of it, and you can look at, people say, well, he's breaking up the 10 Commandments. I believe when he says the law and the prophets, he's saying the entirety of it all, he says, is to love people. Is that what God was trying to build? And Jesus, again, is saying, I have the authority to fully expound what this means, is to love God. And what you do with that is love your neighbors. You love the people around you. You love the people God put you in touch with. You love. That the foundation of the law is embodied in love of God and people. Now, I know what some of you might be thinking is, so there are people who say they love God and love their neighbor, but they sure love in a pretty harsh way. They might still love, they love in a pretty judgmental way. They love in a way that seems to harm and not heal. Maybe they love in a way that doesn't feel like love at all. And I don't think we can, right? I think we have to recognize, this is going to be, I don't know, I feel like I need to say this, wolves in sheep clothing. I think we need to recognize when love is in love. I think we can't hold the world accountable. We can surely hold ourselves accountable to how we love. We need to ask ourselves, is the love that I'm giving, is it the way Jesus loved? Am I walking with those who are on the margin? Am I walking with those who no one else wants to walk with? Am I sitting with those who are unclean? Am I sitting with those who others and the religious people are putting to the side? Am I loving in a way that's unconditional and sacrificial, that's selfless, that puts others' needs ahead of my own? Am I loving in this way? Because that's the way Jesus taught how to love. I find it fascinating when people are loving differently, they don't mention Jesus' words at all. They like to find those obscure passages, or even Paul's words, put words into Paul's mouth that I'm sure Paul never meant to say, this is what needs to happen, or this is what we need to do. Well, what did Jesus say? Well, that was before. Let's look at what Paul said about the church. But then they want to dive to the Old Testament. I think the litmus test is, Jesus says the law is about pursuing God with all you have and essentially pursuing people with all you have. And that's why he came, and that's what he modeled. And so are we doing that? We're going to jump back to that when we get to the end. And we're going to help ourselves understand what that means a little better, I hope. But as we move on, because Jesus leaves, and the apostles are left to try to figure out, like, what are we supposed to do? He's gone. Paul and others feel this call to the Gentiles. Oh, those unclean dogs, so to speak. We're these righteous, Jesus-following Jews. What do we do with these Gentiles? So turn to head to Acts. (15) Yes, Acts 15. So they pull this council together in Jerusalem. Paul, Barnabas, James, who seems to have taken the lead of the church. And they're trying to figure out how Gentiles and Jews can be together worshiping Jesus. And we cannot read this as if it's written to say what laws should be followed. It's not written for that reason, right? James and these guys aren't coming to figure out what laws. We want the answer, right? We want answers. And so like, okay, what am I not supposed to do? What am I supposed to do? But we get this idea that what they're trying to do is figure out a means for Jews and Gentiles to worship Jesus in the same space. And that matters for the Jewish folks. But look at what James says in verse 19. Verse 19 is key. He says, "Therefore my judgment is that we should not trouble those of the Gentiles who turn to God." What does that mean? We should not burden them. They've come to know Jesus, right? They've essentially been set free in the power of Christ, and so we shouldn't trouble them. We shouldn't burden them. We shouldn't put laws on top of them, essentially. So then he lists 4 things. And so should we read them as Old Testament laws? Or should we read them as ways that Jews and Gentiles can get together? Should we read them maybe in a way that says maybe what they're talking about is how the Gentiles used to worship in their pagan temples? And if we look at it that way, the meaning seems to make a lot more sense, right? Otherwise, what he's doing is he's putting Jewish laws on top of them, then he's troubling them and he's burdening them. And so we don't want to read it as if he's putting those laws on top of them. He's saying to them, you can't keep going to the pagan temple. And what did they used to do at the pagan temple? Well, they would be polluted by the idol worship. They'd be polluted by temple prostitution. They would be polluted by how they handled their sacrifices and the drinking of blood. The stuff they did in the pagan worships of what the Gentiles did. And they're like, you can't do that anymore when you're following Jesus. And so, man, we would really like it is when we gather to worship Jesus that you haven't done that. That you're not coming from one of your former worship places, because that kind of makes us unclean. And that just wouldn't work for us, right? So they're not listing out, okay, let's leave Law 433, Law 68. No, just saying, look, you can't do what you did in your temple worship before and come to our synagogue and worship. Which makes sense. Because he's saying, we don't want to trouble them, right? Why would we do that? But we like to trouble people, I think, don't we? We like to trouble them. I've been thinking about this in the different places I've pastored and different conversations I've had. And I think about it in the terms of allowing people to come to the table. And what I mean by that is coming and worshiping with you, or even coming to your table to have discussion, and they don't even believe and follow Jesus. But even in that, right, we don't let people come to our table unless maybe they follow a few guidelines first. You can't come to our table until you get yourself right, and I'm going to decide what right is. You can't come to my table until you've got this portion of your life right. You can't come to my table until you denounce that portion. You can't come to my table. I want to burden you and come to the table. I feel like Jesus just welcomed people to the table. I feel like the Jews are trying to find the easiest answer here. They don't want to be polluted by what occurred in the pagan temple, but they're saying when we worship Jesus, this is the simplest thing we can come up with for you Gentiles to be present. Church, are we open to welcoming everybody to the table? Are we open to allowing people to come to our table? To say, hey, wait a second, you got to stay outside the door till you fix a few things. But then I come to the question, is anybody ever really right, meaning righteous? I mean, I'm not going to be fully sanctified until eternity. I'm in a process of sanctification. I'm right with God because of Jesus, but that's the only reason. If Jesus stepped aside, that would be a shock. Right? I'm only righteous because of Him, and I still need to be sanctified just like you do and just like everybody else does, but yet we want to put stipulations on who can worship with us, who can fellowship with us, who can come to our table. Now, and I want to say this as politely and as gently as I can, because some of us are sitting there saying, not me, and I'm saying, bull. Because we all have a little thing we just need people to clean up and fix up. And that just, or puts me off, or sends me another way. That's human nature. But are we striving to love like Jesus? And so the fulfillment of the Old Testament law is Christ. His instruction to us is to love Him and pursue Him and chase after Him and to love each other. And I struggle with both of those. Imagine 613 plus or 613 minus. I struggle with those two. To pursue God with all I have and to love all those He puts in my life on a regular basis. To be sacrificial and unconditional. So I saw a quote. God's so good to me. So good to me. I don't deserve to find such good quotes. But I'm going to read most of it because it's long. But it really fits with what we've been talking about. Again, it's by Rachel Held Evans. Really good. It's what we've been saying about Scripture. It's what we've been saying about how the Bible is used. But I think it so fits, the last two lines of it so fit with what I believe God is asking of us through the Old and the New Testament. So here's what she says. If you are looking for verses with which to support slavery, you'll find them. If you are looking for verses with which to abolish slavery, you'll find them. If you're looking for verses with which to oppress women, you'll find them. If you're looking for verses which will liberate or honor women, you'll find them. If you're looking for reasons to wage war, you'll find them. If you're looking for reasons to promote peace, you'll find them. If you're looking for an outdated, irrelevant, ancient text, you'll find it. If you're looking for truth, believe me, you'll find it. This is why there are times when the most instructive question to bring to the text is not what does it say, but what am I looking for? I suspect Jesus knew this when He said, ask and it will be given to you. Seek and you will find. Knock and the door will be opened. Are we seeking Christ? Are we seeking His ways? Not my ways with a little Jesus sprinkled in. But are we seeking His ways fully? And she ends with this. If you want to do violence in this world, you will always find your weapons. If you want to heal, you'll always find the balm. Church, are we healers? I mean, we have to ask ourselves that question. I believe that 100%. I believe that's what Jesus is getting at. Jesus came to heal. But if I want to hurt people, I can find my weapon. Whether that's my mouth, whether that's ignoring them, whether that's oppressing them, whether that's not seeking justice on their behalf, whatever it might be, I can find a way in this ancient text to justify myself. But if I believe God's called me to be a healer, then I know I'll find the balm. I'll know I'll find Him as He leads me to help others to do that. The privilege I get as a pastor is to be a part of that, right? Is to be a part of helping people meet Jesus and go deeper with Him. I'm not a healer in any way, but He is. My job is to be the in-between guy. That's your job. Right? Our job isn't to get people, hey, you got to be fully transformed. You got to get yourself right. I can never do that to anybody. I can help people change their behaviors. I can help people, right, with behavior modification. We all pretty good at that. Jesus, through the power of the Holy Spirit, is the only one who can transform people. So why do I try to get caught up in being the transformer? We should be caught up in bringing the balm. We should be caught up in bringing Jesus to broken people. We should be caught up in bringing Jesus to the world. Not in, hey, Jesus wants to condemn you because you're this or that. That's my view, right? What I need to do is, I just want to bring love to you, man. I don't even know what's going on in your life, but God has sent me to just love you unconditionally. And I'm going to do that. Church, this is how I want to be known as a human being. Right? I mean, when I go on, I hope someone stands up and says, you know what? He cared about people and cared about seeing people healed. To see people find love. To see people set free in some way, to see people's lives changed. Is that what's important to us? Right? Jesus says, and I always have to come back to this. I'm like, okay, so I'm supposed to be a little Jesus, right? That's what Christian means, little Jesus, little Christ. And I'm supposed to be a follower of him. He calls people to follow, okay. And what did he say? He said, love God and love people. If my life doesn't exemplify that, I don't think I'm following. If there's hate in somewhere in me that's being projected on others, or I'm trying to play power plays over others, or I'm trying to control others, I have to be able to look in the mirror and say, I don't believe that's Jesus. Jesus didn't sit on the throne of Rome and oppress people. Jesus actually did the exact opposite of that in a very magnificent, sacrificial, life-changing way. So as we come to this end, right, and we're going to talk conversation next week, but as we come to this end, I really hope that through these great questions that you've asked, I feel like I keep ending with Jesus. But it seems like a pretty good place to end. And do we look like him? Do we act like him? Do we talk like him? Should always be our litmus test. Regardless of all the other passages you want to go to and look at and say, this is this. Man, if it doesn't match up with who Jesus is and how he walked and how he lived, you better reevaluate. That's who he's called us to be, is like him. To chase after him with everything we have. And to chase after each other. And those on the fringe. And those who even the religious have set aside. And to be love and hope and peace to a very chaotic world where there isn't a whole lot of that. Church, I hope that's us. I hope that's how we're known. As Lucas and Bill and Ian come, let's just close in prayer. And I want you to ask God this question. I want you to ask him this question. Who is it in my life, whether they're close or far, that you need me to love unconditionally today and tomorrow? So they're just going to play instrumentally for a minute. I want you to ask that question. I want you to listen. Who God gives you an image of. Who's that person in your life that God wants you to love unconditionally right now? And say yes to whoever that is.